Welcome to the Rabia and Sana show. We're two Desi girls reinventing cultural norms with love to make difficult conversations easier to help you take courageous steps faster.
Whether you feel like a misfit now or have been breaking the standards, this podcast is for you, for the adults, the young. Come as you be and become your authentic self as you desire. Let's go reinvent some cultural norms together.
Hello everyone, I am Rabia Paracha. I have been a rebel without a cause for most of my life until I discovered my purpose to empower women to empower themselves. And that led me down a rabbit hole to become a life coach from CTI Coactive Coaching. And today I'm a mind and life power coach who helps people break free of their limiting cultural beliefs to find the life they love and the love of their life.
Hello everyone, I am Sana. I am from New Jersey, a Pakistani American. Professionally, I work in the clinical research field. And personally, I have always had this purpose of empowering women of South Asian culture to be able to live the life that they want to live and be true to themselves instead of what the culture expects them to be. And so here I am pursuing that purpose, and I am also studying to become a life coach. Let's get started.
Hello, amazing souls. Welcome to another episode of the Rabia and Sana show, the podcast where we reinvent cultural norms to elevate your mental, emotional, and overall well-being. I'm Rabia Paracha.
And I'm Sana Shah. Hello, everyone. In this episode, we are going to explore grief and healing from loss with our guest, Michelle Gill, who is an author and speaker who holds space for grief, loss, and mental health. Michelle is also known as the Grief Curator. Welcome, Michelle. It's so great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me today. Really looking forward to today's conversation.
So, Michelle, before we get started, can you please tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, back in 2018, I lost my father when he was 94 years old. And I thought that I was ready, but I was not. And from there, I took my own grief journey, still on my grief journey. And in the midst of that, I decided to transform my pain into a purpose to hold space for other people who are also going through grief and loss.
Beautiful. You know, I share that in common with you because I also lost my father. So it's actually going to be 36 years this year. I can't wait to explore what grief is and how we can navigate it to understand it better. I know grief is really difficult, and there were so many things along the path of going through my dad's loss that I didn't understand. I didn't understand what was happening, what to do, how to navigate it. So before we begin today, I would love for you to tell us, what is grief?
Grief is that feeling that we go through when somebody close to us dies. It can also cover any loss that we experience in life. That could be the loss of a pet, could be the loss of a job, the loss of a dream, and as many people know, the loss of a homeland. So grief are these complex feelings that encompass so many things: anger, sadness, depression, and there's even joy in the midst there as well, sometimes relief. So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to grief.
And are there misconceptions or something that we don't understand that you could clarify for us?
Yes. I'll begin by saying almost a decade ago, I became involved in mental health advocacy. And one of the big campaigns back then was to end the stigma around mental illness and mental health, that we should start talking about it. Grief is closely related to mental health advocacy. It is also something that there is a stigma around. It is a topic that a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about. There's a lot of things that go into that. Some of them are cultural norms, but mostly on just a purely human level, nobody wants to think about death, either their own or losing their loved ones. So we get very uncomfortable, it gets very itchy. And this is why I do what I do. I want to hold space for people to help them feel comfortable talking about these uncomfortable things. Because I don't know if you've heard, but there is no cure for death. So we all have a stake in talking about grief and loss.
Yeah, that's so true, Michelle. So what are some of the ways that grief impacts mental health? Also, going through grief or a loss while you already have mental health conditions going on. What are the impacts of it and how does it affect us?
Well, before I say anything else, just a quick disclaimer.
Mhm.
I am not a licensed therapist, so anything that I share today with you and your listeners is for informational and educational purposes and is based solely on my own personal experience. It's a great, great question, Sana. Let's unpack this a little bit. So first we'll begin with grief and its impact on our mental health. There's actually two components here because we're mind and body. And that is that both our mental and our physical health can be impacted by grief. In fact, there is a term called grief brain, where things seem very foggy mentally. You become more forgetful. You sleep more, or you cannot sleep. You get very angry, or you bottle everything up inside. It really depends on your grief journey. And as I tell my grieving community, grief is as personal as your fingerprint. This is why really no one has the right to tell you how you should grieve and how you should feel. How you feel is how you feel. And grief can often be complicated depending on who or what it is that you lost, what your relationship to them was like. So, yes, grief can have a profound impact on our mental health. Um, so now the other layer to that is if we're already dealing with something. So I personally, I came out with my struggle with depression over a decade ago. And oftentimes people will say, well, what is it? Is it depression or is it grief? And so often the two can become enmeshed. After my father died in 2018, for that first year, I pretty much cocooned. I stopped most of my social engagements. I went to work, went into work and got those things done barely. But otherwise, I just didn't have the energy. And I did a lot of sleeping, which I think was my body's way of coping, but also my mind, just to kind of deal with the shock. After a year in 2019, I had been in therapy before for my depression and various things. And I went back specifically for grief because I felt like I need to talk to someone who's objective. I couldn't talk to my family because they were all grieving. And I felt like I didn't have space to grieve. Nobody was holding space for me in that sense, meaning um, keeping company with me on my grief journey without judgment. And so I went back to therapy for that. And, of course, that's going to uncover a lot of other things too. We don't grieve in a vacuum. Life goes on, we have responsibilities, and then we also have all this other baggage that we bring with us, including intergenerational trauma, our own personal trauma. So, yes, it becomes kind of a knotty ball of yarn almost, where you have to unravel. So a lot there, a lot there.
Yeah, definitely a lot there. And, you know, when there are different cultures involved, when people are from different places and different religions, where everything sort of unravels in a very different way, and different cultures have different attitudes towards grief. And in our South Asian culture, there is a pressure and expectation to be strong, to be there for your kids and for your family members, and just to move on. And that holding space, which we'll get into, I think we need to cover that a little bit later. So what are some things you can suggest to people when they're going through this difficult time and experiencing uncomfortable emotions, to do things differently? And just what can you say to our listeners to understand this process better?
Mm. Well, I want to say that you brought up a very good point in that depending on the culture that you're in, there are going to be societal expectations. This is true no matter what your culture is. And like I said, life goes on. We as grievers want to press pause. We want to get off the world for a little bit. And we want the world to acknowledge our grief. Hey, something huge just happened. I lost a person. And I don't know what to do with myself anymore. And so often, in a lot of cultures, and it sounds like in your culture as well, who bears the brunt of that? Who must be strong? And it's often one person in the family, and it's often women. I'll get a little bit into men as well, because grief does not know. It comes to everyone, and it looks different on everyone. The first thing that I would say is that outside of societal and familial expectations, the one universal truth for all humans: you cannot give from an empty cup. It's so cliche to say today, but it's so true. How can you hold space for others if you're not first holding space for yourself? And so the first thing that I tell my grieving community, no matter where they're from: stop. Take a deep breath and allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you are feeling. Whether it's anger at the loss of your person, whether it's desperation of what am I going to do now, whether it's just deep, deep sadness, whether it's relief. Sometimes when someone dies, it's a relief. We often also feel guilty and regret. Just sit with yourself. Check in with your body. What is it that I'm feeling? What specifically is that related to? Like, what aspect? Am I angry that my person is gone and I no longer have financial stability? Am I scared of that? First, we have to acknowledge exactly what is going on. This is just like when you go to the doctor. You have a symptom. You have to figure out, okay, what is it that you're feeling? Where is the pain? Is it in this part of the body? How long have you been feeling it? Does it increase with certain activity? It's the same type of thing. What am I feeling right now? Okay, I'm feeling anxious. Okay, what just happened today outside of the main part of, okay, I've lost a person, but what happened today that makes me feel anxious? What is it about this loss that is causing me anxiety? And to parse that and pick it apart and sit with it. And I often tell my grievers, yes, our grief journey is as personal as a fingerprint, but we are not built to shoulder this burden alone. It is vital that we have an understanding and supportive community. So reach out. I also tell people, don't wait for the griever to reach out, reach in. This is a big thing of mine. Because when you're grieving, especially within that first 6 months to a year, you can barely put one foot in front of the other. So it's vital to have people around you who understand and can pour into you. That would be my first thing to tell them. Just acknowledge whatever it is that you're feeling.
That's really beautiful, Michelle. So, I myself lost my father when I was 17 years old. And I think the three of us share that in common, that we all lost our dad. And processing emotions is what you're saying, feeling it and really holding that space for yourself. What am I feeling? And I know in my own journey, I definitely did not have the time or know how to do that. And um, back to what Rabia was saying about the cultural expectation and pressure, I mean, that played a big part in my own journey too. And what I have seen in my experience in the South Asian culture when it comes to loss is we just don't process those emotions. We just don't want to go there because it's so vulnerable and it's so difficult. And it's really putting yourself out there in front of everyone, and it's kind of a little bit shameful and a little bit of guilt in there too. And so we don't do it. We just don't do it as a community, as coming together. And in my experience, it was sort of like we all were grieving in our own silos. We didn't do it together. And so it didn't feel like as if there was support at all. And it was also, of course, like you said, life is moving on. You can't take that many days off of school. You have to go back. There's things happening, and people have to go back to work. So when we get into the process of grieving and healing, what are the steps that a person can go through or expect and be aware that this is part of my grief?
Well, the first thing I would say is that grief is not linear. I often bring this up when I talk about grief and loss and the journey. A lot of people are familiar, I don't know if your listeners are, but familiar with the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Decades ago, she and David Kessler wrote a book called On Death and Dying. And a lot of people read that book or know about that book, and they apply it to grievers. When in actuality, when you read the book, it was written for people in hospice care, people who have been given a terminal diagnosis. They are facing their own death. So we often hear about the 5 stages of death and dying. Acceptance, denial, anger. Now, all those things, all those feelings are also present in those of us left behind. But there aren't any steps. It's not like one day or one month you're angry about it, and the next month you work through that and you're in denial, and then the next step is now I'm going to accept it. You can experience all the emotions of grief in a day, in a few hours. I remember in 2020, the very beginning of the pandemic, and my father died in July. And in June, end of June of that year, I became extremely irritable, lost my temper a lot, was depressed, fatigued, couldn't sleep, but would alternately sleep too much. And it wasn't until the day of his death anniversary that it clicked. And here I am in the grief space. I talk to people about this all the time, and I myself, on the day, realized, oh, this is why the last 3 weeks have been so rough. This is why I've been crying at the drop of a hat. For whatever, and it's on my calendar, not like I would ever forget the date. It's dates that I just would never forget. But now what I do is I put on the calendar a month ahead of time. It's coming. Drink more water, take more walks, increase your meditation, increase your yoga. We have to be aware. And that is one of the steps that we can take, is just to be aware of what's going on, what the date is, how much more time we have before the death anniversary, and what are we doing to take care of ourselves in that time. I have made it a point to take that specific day off. My dad's death anniversary, I take that day off. And now I also take, if I can, a day or two ahead of that, just to give myself space. And I have begun to communicate that with my colleagues. Not always, depending on who they are, oh, I'm getting ready to hold space for my dad's death anniversary. No, but I'll say, I'm going to be taking some time off. I just need you to fill in if you can. And usually, if somebody asks, I'll tell them. Um, but yeah, so that's one of the things that we can do, is just to be aware of those dates. And again, it goes back to being, to just being aware of what we're feeling and why. Yes, life goes on. Bills have to be paid. Work must be done. But we are not machines. We are not AI. We need time. We need to take care of ourselves. And I heard ZZ Williams, who is on Clubhouse quite a bit. She holds self-care rooms. It was so profound what she said the other day. She said, self-care is not a luxury. It's not pampering that we give ourselves. It is necessary for our survival and our thriving. So taking that time. I mean, would you really try to walk on a if you had a fractured femur? No, you'd put a cast on it. You'd sit in a wheelchair. Whatever it was, the doctor would say, don't put so much pressure on that. You need to let it heal. Same thing with our heart. Same thing with our psyche. And that's why part of my work in the grief space is to raise awareness, is to show that, the average, at least in the United States, is 3 days bereavement leave, which is nothing when it comes to loss and preparing. So, yes, just recognizing that and taking that step. The other thing, too, that's more practical, hydrate. It sounds so simple and almost stupid. Like, really? Really, you want me to drink more water? Yes. Because in the dark recess of the night, even when no one is around, we cry. We release that pent up emotion. And in the process, we dehydrate ourselves. So hydration is key when dealing with grief.
So important, so important. These small things can make such a big difference. And I love the point that you made about awareness. And when you were speaking, a bit of awareness came to me as you prepared, right? You prepare for those times. So on March 25th, on the Islamic calendar, is my dad's 36th uh, anniversary. And so that came up for me. And it's really For me, that process was so unique because it took me 20 years to come to terms with my father's death. 20 years of not understanding what I was going through, why I felt sad, why I felt angry, why I was so irritable, why I was so sad, like really sad. And one fine day, I was driving back from a healing session and I saw a number that always reminds me of my dad. It was his phone number. 366 were the first three numbers of his phone number. And on a license plate, I saw the number.
Mm.
And in that moment, I said, my dad never left. He's not here in the way that he used to be here. His physical presence wasn't there for me anymore. So that navigating through was to establish a new relationship with my father, but also to honor my emotions. It's when I opened that bottle, when I had that realization, it was like I had closed this bottle so tight, not to feel, not to experience his loss, that when I just made that acknowledgement that I'm going to have a new relationship with him, that bottle opened and I explored sadness. I went there, which I was afraid to because I thought I would fall apart, that I wouldn't be able to hold it together. And it was a total opposite. And so then I began to honor my father's memories. I could go there to remember him without crying, without feeling a loss, because now I've embraced he never left. He just isn't there in the same way. And so that was my journey. And it can be different for different people. And it is different for different people. That was my way to normalcy. What are some other ways people can explore this space to honor their loved ones and experience loss and then still move on?
I'll answer that with an anecdote from one of my grieving community. Their parents did not want a funeral. No memorial service, no funeral, nothing. They're like, we don't want anybody to be sad. We just want to cremate us and spread our ashes. And they wanted to honor their parents, so they did that. But they were left feeling like they had an open wound. There was no closure because there had been no ritual. I believe, and I think anthropologic studies will back this up, humans need ritual. Whatever that is, whatever that looks like for you, we crave it. There's something in us that craves ritualistic activities for certain things to mark milestones. So I told this person, I said, it's my belief that funerals and memorials and wakes are really for the living, not really for the dead. You honored your parents' wishes. Now you need to honor yours. It is okay for you to have a ritual, whatever that is. It could be a memorial service at church. It could be a celebration in a field. It could be dinner at their favorite restaurant. You get to decide how you're going to honor their memory and honor your grief. And I think that's key what you said, Rabia, that you found a way to honor your father and to unpack those feelings that you had bottled up. And I think that's so beautiful, by the way, that he's still here, just in a different way. I too feel that about my dad. I feel him everywhere, in my childhood home. And I just feel like he's still protecting me and watching out for me. And I talk to him every day. It's going to look different for everyone, but finding a way to honor them and your grief is key. And again, it's okay to do that. It's okay to mark the anniversary. It's okay, even. I'm going to be careful how I say this. It's okay to even not mark the anniversary. As long as you're not keeping it in denial and ignoring it, because when we ignore those things, when we suppress it for too long, it's going to come out. It's going to come out in other ways, and sometimes unhealthy. I also wanted to say that it was okay that it took you that long. Again, the grief is not linear. There is no timeline. There's no time limit. It's okay that it took you that long. It's okay that you didn't know what was going on. Everybody has their time. And in that moment when you were ready, boom, he spoke to you in a license plate. I believe that, and I love that story. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for acknowledging that, because I think it's also really important to know that it wasn't a waste of my 20 years
Right.
not to grieve and not to go through that. That is beautiful. Sometimes in that experience, I'm like, why did I wait so long? Sometimes there's that element of regret that I had, that it was this easy to grieve, that I'm allowed to be angry. Whatever I experienced was natural. So that's really beautiful. I want to add one more piece to my grieving and our loss of my father. As a family, in January of 1987, and he didn't pass until May of 1988. So almost a year and a half. And there's a new term that I learned about from Anderson Cooper about anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
And anticipatory grief is you start grieving because my father was given his death sentence on January, I think it was 12th or 13th of 1987. You have 3 months to live, but you don't know how long that 3 months is because my dad passed 18 months later. And so that living with that knowledge, with that knowing that your loved one is going to die. We all know everyone's going to die, but living with that anticipatory grief, it's so difficult. I can't explain it. It was like a living, like my morning had begun, that I'm going to lose my father. Can you speak to those people that might be living through, a loved one going through an illness where they know that that's the outcome? How do you deal with anticipatory grief?
Yeah, that is a tough one. It's true. We know on some level that we're all going to die. We know we're going to lose our parents at some point. But we live as if that isn't going to happen. I mean, and that's good. I think if I had to live with the fact that that I knew when I was going to die, I think it'd probably be hastened because I'd be worrying about the day. It's a way that our mind protects us and that we get through our life, getting through the day-to-day stuff, not thinking about all those things. It's kind of like breathing. We don't think about it, we just do it. When it comes to anticipatory grief and people whose loved one has a terminal diagnosis or even a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, and even to an extent those who have a chronic diagnosis, Yes, there is anticipatory grief. There is grief around the things you lose prior to losing the person. As with any grief, I truly believe, and I'm probably going to say this throughout our time together, that awareness, that self-awareness of, okay, what is it that I'm going through? The awareness that this is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling grief. I don't want this person to leave. I'm angry that they're going to leave sooner than I think they should. I'm angry at all the things we won't do together. I'm anxious about how my life is going to look once they actually leave. I'm sad that we won't get the time together that I thought we would. Truly sitting with that and recognizing our emotions and what it is that we're feeling and sharing that with a safe person is so key. Again, I'm going to say this again. Grief is as personal as our fingerprint. It is a journey that we take alone because no one has our relationship with that person that we do. Your relationship with your father is different from your sibling's relationship with your father, is different from your mother's relationship with your father. You lost a father, she lost a spouse.
Mm.
If his parents were alive, they lost a child. Grandkids, they're losing a grandfather. All these different relationships, it adds to why we grieve differently. But even though we walk this grief journey by ourselves, in the sense that nobody is going to experience it the way we do, I see our grief journey as parallel roads, parallel paths, and we are able to reach across and hold the hand of somebody else who's grieving. So yes, we're each experiencing things differently, but we can still be there. We can still hold space.
Beautiful. And I just wanted to say, like everything you say is so, it touches my heart so deeply. And you're so right that it's so different for all of us, even siblings, right? And so 2 years ago, and it just popped up for me right now. 2 years ago, my brother, sister, and I went down memory lane, and we went to where we had gone to school together, the house that we lived in our childhood. And then we went to our schools, the different schools that we went to, and where we had lunch. And going down that memory lane for the first time in 34 years, because it was 2 years ago, we sat down and we actually talked about what that experience was for us when we lost our father. My sister was 15, I was 20, my brother was 22. And the three of us as adults in our 50s are sitting together and having that conversation. If I could say this from my personal experience, I think if everyone can sit together and just share that story and hold space, like you say, it was so therapeutic. It made me feel so much closer to my siblings. And it made me feel like I was seen and heard by my siblings, which I may have wanted in that moment when I lost my father, and which I wanted to do for my siblings as well. And so that just popped up, and I thought it was just very timely to share. Thank you so much.
That's really, really beautiful, Rabia. I think that it's something that I'm thinking throughout our conversation here right now. What can a loss do for us after we process it and for our existing relationships? And I think it's so beautiful, Rabia, that you were able to do that with your siblings. It's something I really crave because in my family, it's been 22 years and we still have never talked about it? What did you feel? What did you go through? Every time this comes up, we avoid it. I avoid it myself. And I've been on my own personal journey to process it on my own, but I think I'm at a point where I would like to talk to them about it, but I don't know if they are there, you know? So I was thinking, as Rabia was saying, and then Michelle, you were talking about the new normalcy stage. What all of these things after we do this awareness and we process and we sit with our feelings, we go back and forth in the stages of the grief. What can this do for us in our mental health space in general for feeling other emotions, you know, for preparing for when other things happen to us in life? Not just the loss of family, loss of, you know, a relationship ending, any type of a loss, and the impact it can have in our existing relationships in general.
Mm. Deep, deep topics today. Which is why a lot of people don't like to talk about grief, because there's a lot to unpack. And as I said, it can be very uncomfortable, but it is key that we become comfortable with uncomfortable topics and talking about them in such a way that is in and of itself healing. One of the things that comes up in grief, usually after the first year of a loss, and that is you begin to experience joy. You begin to experience beauty again. And with that comes guilt. Sometimes we feel like we're betraying the person that we've lost because we are getting on with life without them. They are no longer here physically to see us do these things, to celebrate with us, to mourn with us. It is important to acknowledge that a growth mindset is very helpful at times like this. A growth mindset looks at life as both and, not either or. Life is almost never black and white. It is filled with multiple shades of gray. And acknowledging that and saying, I can miss my person. I can miss the good aspects of a marriage or a relationship. And I can feel relief. And I can still take joy in life. And I can still move on. They aren't mutually exclusive. Grief and joy are sisters. And I think that is also important to acknowledge. Once the initial feelings, and I say initial feelings, but there's a caveat here. Remember, I said that grief is not linear. So, Rabia, it's been 36 years for you. Sana, how long has it been for you?
22.
22 years. For me, it'll be 6 years in July. It doesn't matter. Time, especially in grief, is just a construct. It means nothing and it means everything. I'll never forget a dear friend of mine was talking about his brother. And he had lost his brother when his brother was in his 20s and my friend was in his late teens. He's now 60 something. And the other day, a song came on the radio and it reminded him of his brother. Either it was his brother's favorite song or they had both listened to it growing up, and he burst into tears. And how long has it been? Years, decades. That doesn't mean that he can't grieve. It doesn't mean that he's not allowed to break down and cry and miss his brother. Someone said the other day, I will not stop grieving because I have not stopped loving my person. And I thought that was really beautiful. It's part of my tagline: grief is not a problem to be fixed, it's love with nowhere to go. And I truly believe that. The love is still here. I didn't stop loving my dad. You didn't stop loving your dad. So the grief, there's no expiration date. And sometimes people hear that and they think, oh, that's terrible. That means that you never get over it. But I don't want to get over it. It's not something to get over. It's something to grow around. And I wanted to say too that for a lot of grievers, and I have seen this in the grief space, in interacting and talking with other people who do what I do, who hold space for people who are going through loss. We have all been touched by loss. It's what brought us into the space in the first place. For us, we chose to rechannel that love, rechannel that energy into something healing for ourselves. I mean, I definitely get something out of it when I hold space for people. But it's also kind of repackaging it almost so that it can be healing for other people. And I think that for a lot of us, that's key. You mentioned, what do we do after we've unpacked this and we've held space for ourselves and we've acknowledged our feelings? What happens next? Well, for a lot of us, it's using that raw material of grief for a purpose. But it's also okay if you don't. I also hold space for that, So,
Everyone gets to decide for themselves.
right.
That's what I'm hearing from you, is that you can do what feels best for you. One thing that you've said so consistently from the beginning of this episode till now is holding space. Can you tell us what that is and how it's different from help and support?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you want to learn more about holding space, I highly recommend Heather Plett's book, The Art of Holding Space. And she talks about how the definition of holding space is being present on someone's journey without judgment. I think that's so key. And a big part of that is active listening. And listening not to respond, but to just listen. So many of us today, I think, don't feel heard, don't feel seen in general. But grief, oh, 1,000% more. We don't feel our grief is seen and heard. It's not given space. Because, hey, we've got to keep going. And the person's gone. Gee, thanks. So, holding space. One of the things that I did actually prior to my dad passing away, I learned in my friendships to ask 3 questions. Whenever somebody would come to me in a state or hurting, and I would say, what do you need from me in this moment? Do you want me to just listen? Do you want my advice? Do you want me to just hug you in silence? Do you want all 3? One of the things that this does, and especially for those who are grieving, it gives them back choice. It gives them back their power. They get to decide what you give them. Because when you're grieving, especially with the death of a loved one, you feel like all your choices have been ripped away from you. And you feel you feel like you're drifting and you're lost. I've talked to a lot of grievers, and I myself personally experienced this. I don't know about you guys, but I felt lost. Who am I now without my dad? Who is Michelle? I'm still a daughter, but without a father. What does that mean? So giving power back to the person and allowing them to choose. Because again, everyone grieves differently. So some people, they don't even want to talk about it. And that's fine. That's fine. So you hold space for that. You don't force them to talk about it. You just say, that's okay. What would you like to do? So I found that asking these 3 questions has really helped all my relationships, but is especially important for those who are grieving.
I would love for you to repeat those questions. They're really important.
Yeah. So, what do you need from me in this moment? Do you need me to just listen? Do you need my advice? Do you want me to just hold you in silence? Or do you want all 3? The other thing, too, I cover this in my book. I have a chapter in my book called The Shit That You Shouldn't Say. Because when people are grieving, there are certain phrases that a lot of people will say, and they think that they're being comforting, and it's really hurtful. And one of them is, well, you just call me. Just tell me what you need. I'll be there. No. Now, I said asking the 3 questions gave choice back and power back. However, telling someone, oh, just call me when you need me, especially in the first 6 months to a year, they're not going to call. We don't have the energy. We don't want to feel like a burden. We don't want to be the sad person in the room. So this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about those of us who are being supportive of somebody who's grieving. We need to reach in instead of waiting for them to reach out. And this kind of ties back to the 3 questions as well. The other thing too that people will say is, oh, I know exactly how you're feeling. I lost my dog 10 years ago. Hey, it's important. Your grief over your pet, that's important. It's valid. It is also not the same as losing a spouse or losing a parent or losing a child. And all of those losses aren't the same as each other. One of the things that I've told my grieving community, grief is like a house. When you build a house, generally all your foundations are going to look the same. They have to be, there's certain things you have to have in a foundation so that the house does not implode and fall down. So generally our foundations of grief are going to look the same. However, the house that we build on top of those foundations can vary widely. I also like to say there is no comparison in grief. My grief is different from yours. It is not more important or less important than yours. It's just different. So when you are holding space, do not insert yourself into their grief story. This isn't your story. You are there to just be with them as they walk theirs. And sometimes it'll switch and they'll be there to hold space for yours, but they shouldn't insert their story into your grief story because it's different. So doing that without judgment. This goes back to what I said about how important a growth mindset is, because a growth mindset takes things in and is curious and does not impose judgment on somebody else's story or their journey. Because you don't have all the chapters. You don't have the rough draft. You don't know what they've been through or necessarily what their personality type is or what other burdens they're carrying. So just listening. And when you listen to their words and also what they're not saying. I have to tell you a quick story that just happened recently. I thought it was pretty funny, but also insightful. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with the latest AI. It's called Pi, P-I.ai. You can have a conversation with Pi You can type in your questions or ask to brainstorm, and you can choose to have Pi talk to you in 5 different voices. Mine, of course, is a British male, because, And I asked Pi, I was having some difficulty with a particular relationship, and I said, wow, what should I say about this? And Pi was able to approximate or mimic empathy and holding space for me, which was fascinating because I realized not all humans can do that. However, what is important to realize is that if an AI can be programmed to learn to show an approximation of empathy and holding space, most certainly humans can do that. And that's very true. It's what's so beautiful about holding space and empathy. These two things can be learned. Some people are naturally gifted at it, but everyone can learn to do it. It just takes practice.
Wow, that was so beautiful, Michelle. I love the your explanation of holding space. It's so beautiful and it's so supportive. And I feel like I see the difference between help and holding space. And um I think it's just so amazing that, how you explained it and how we could do that for each other. And, I'm myself guilty of that. When I see my friends going through a loss, all I really want to say is, hey, I went through it too, to kind of make them feel like I get you. But now I see that I will never be able to get it because everyone has their own journey, their own relationship, their own way of dealing with it. And there's no way we will ever be able to get another person's experience. So just space, being there for them. I love that. That is so nice. Thank you. Thank you really for sharing that. Rabia, I don't know if you had anything to add on to.
I think what you described is active listening. It's being present to somebody. It's really just listening without opinion, without a thought, just being present to who you're with in this moment and just giving them what they need. And I'm so glad that you're sharing with us that we can learn it, which is the blessing in everything. And we can go back and fix what we didn't do right as well. So just wanted to add that. Our listeners are so lucky that we have you here to understand grief better. Are there tools, resources, support systems in place where they can explore and learn more about grief or just feel that they're not alone?
Well, I will say that if you go to my website, I do have a section where I have a list of resources that I personally have either read or have experienced. David Kessler is he's amazing. He is in the grief space. In fact, I just recently signed up for one of his coaching programs because he is one of the foremost experts in grief and is amazing at holding space. So definitely check out David Kessler. I have a list of books there if people want to go and check those out. One of the biggest things, and I know we're just going to touch on it here because we're probably running out of time, but remember I said that we are not built to shoulder this burden alone. The community, a supportive community who either already knows how to hold space or is willing to learn how to hold space is key.
Mm.
And wow, that could be a whole other topic or workshop because I've met so many people, especially over 40, who find it difficult to build community. And I think going through the pandemic made that worse. We have not seen all of the consequences of that. So community is huge. So find a community, either in person or online that you can go and share. Because here's the other thing about holding space. It can be learned. Not everybody is willing to learn. Not everybody has the capacity to hold space. It is the one thing I will caution my grievers. Be careful who you share with, because not everybody can be that container for you. And some of them will use it against you. So finding that supportive, safe space is key.
I'm so glad you brought up the point of community. I just wanted to add one piece is in Islam, in the Muslim faith, first 3 days after someone passes. And in those 3 days, traditionally what happens is no one cooks in that household
Mm.
because they don't have to worry about doing basic things when you're grieving. So the community gathers and they bring the food and they sit with you from morning till night and they pray with you. And that, I think, that building of community, I love this aspect
Mhm.
of my faith. And no one talks, they pray and we pray together. These are just some things that I've experienced. And when you were talking about community, I thought it would be
Yeah.
nice to add.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And I love that, because you hit on something very key and very practical. You said the people who are grieving, the family of the departed, they don't cook. The community comes together and feeds them. The first 2 days after my father died, because I journaled, because I wanted to make sure that I remembered, and I knew I would remember. The first day, my mother and I didn't eat, just didn't think about it. We were in such shock. And the grief was just so, I mean, it was as if, honestly, a bomb had gone off in our body. Um, and it's why something that seems so like, really, bring food? Yes, because they're not going to eat. They're just not going to think about it. And that first week, of course, we had to make these big decisions. That's a whole other topic about doing your last preparations for your family so they don't have to. But, we were doing all of that, and we did not have that. We did not have that built in. We did have some people that came, some family members that came and brought food and stuff, but generally speaking, um, that is a lack in a lot of places. And this is why I talked about ritual, that even if you decide to replace something, or you decide to leave a particular church or religion, and you don't have anything, you should still put into place something. One of the things I talk about is how, in the United States at least, in the Victorian era, there were certain things that you did when somebody died. You wore black for the first year, especially the widow. And then the second year, you wore purple or whatever. And we threw all of those norms out, because we were like, that's too formal, whatever. It's like, that's fine. It's fine to decide that you want to do something different, that the old traditions don't work for you anymore. That's fine. But replace them with something, because otherwise you're just unmoored. And when it comes to something big like this, where's your community? So thank you for sharing that, Rabia. That's so beautiful. And I wish more people had that built in, because that's truly beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's one thing that I love about our culture and our religion too. We also have another thing where women have like this 3 month, if you lose a husband, they have this built-in 3 month period of I guess she can't go out, and I think the purpose of that is for her to really mourn her loss because the husband is a more closer one. So I think we lose the purpose of why these things were built in and start to think of it's more of maybe a suppression thing, but really the purpose is to take your time to grieve it. So I really like that about our religion and culture, part of that too. And like you said, Michelle, this is learnable. So if the other cultures who don't have it, right, this can be something that can be learned and built in, because it's just about community and support. That's all it really is.
And that's cultural appreciation, not appropriation.
Mm.
I discovered, I'm a huge, I fell in love with the Asian culture, especially East Asian culture and history. And after my father died, and I learned, because I was trying to find my way in my grief journey, like, because I had taken a break from my religion, and I was like, what do I do? Like, I experienced that kind of lost feeling, like these aren't working for me. What can work for me? And one of the things I discovered was, especially in South Korean culture, they have, they acknowledge the death anniversary, and it's kind of expected that you'll take that day off and you'll go and you'll make your person's favorite food, and you'll clean their grave site, and you'll put flowers and you'll put candles and the food there, and you will say prayers. And I thought, oh, I like that. And I tried it the first anniversary, and I was like, this this feels right. This serves me. This honors my grief, and it honors my dad. And so now every year I have his picture, up on the mantle, and I put a candle there, and my mom and I make his favorite, Polish foods, and we go to the grave site. And so just figuring out those things that you can do to honor the person and your grief, and to hold space for yourself, because that's key too. That's one of the key things to learning to hold space for others, is to first hold it for yourself.
Yeah. And I want to add, staying connected with the people that we've lost, and through these small things of, my mom does this as well, and it's a part of our culture as well. We cook on the day of, we call it barsi, on the anniversary it's called barsi, and we my mom makes my dad's favorite sweet. And
Mm,
these small things are built in to our culture and religion. I think they have lost their meaning. And
mm,
now that I'm hearing it from you, that make something that was your dad or your loved one's favorite food,
yeah.
right? And I
Mhm,
think these are small things that are so healing as well.
yeah.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Michelle, for coming on and holding space with us in this space of grief and loss. We we went through great topics in this discussion. We talked about understanding grief, what actually grief is, how can we navigate and cope through it, what does holding space mean, and how can we be supportive to each other by holding space in this grief and loss. I loved it. I felt like I was being held space. So thank you so much, Michelle, for coming on and having this conversation with us.
So honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for honoring us and our listeners. As we wind down, what message would you like to leave our listeners with about grieving and grief?
Whatever or whomever you are grieving, your grief is valid and important and deserves to be seen. You deserve to have someone hold space for you, even if for whatever reason right now it is only you who can hold space for yourself. Grief is not a problem to be fixed, and you can still feel joy along with your grief. It makes you human, not a bad person. Whatever you are feeling right now, place your hand on your heart, take a deep breath, and honor that feeling. And do it in a safe space. And know that whatever else or whomever else, I am holding space for you right now, and sending you all so much love, light, and peace.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Michelle. Where can our listeners find you?
Well, you can find me on all the major social media platforms, but if you just need one place to go, you can go to www.thegriefcurator.com. Would love to
Awesome.
connect with your listeners over there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And we're at that time of our episode, Sana.
Yeah, we are two Daisy girls
Reinventing cultural norms
with love.
with
Bye
love.
bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Please rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow the Rabia and Sana Show on social medias.
Remember, you can watch the video version on YouTube, and don't forget to share, like, and subscribe.
If you want life coaching services, or you are reinventing cultural norms for yourself and think you would be a great guest and want to be on our show, please email contact@therabiaandsanashow.com.
And be sure to check out our next episode. See you next time.
See you next time.